Slavery has existed in many forms throughout history, reducing human beings to property used for labor at the command of others. This was a feature of nearly every society until the 19th century. No system of slavery has drawn more attention than the transatlantic slave trade, established by Europeans to supply labor for their American colonies. Around 12 million people were taken from Africa and forced across the Atlantic, where they and their descendants were condemned to a life of servitude. Yet retellings of Atlantic slavery often focus solely on European actions, overlooking the role Africans played. While millions were enslaved, many others profited from, produced, and protected the trade. Slavery in Africa existed long before Europeans arrived. Ancient Egypt had slaves laboring in fields and on monuments. Carthage trafficked enslaved people across the Mediterranean, and the Ethiopian kings of Aksum recorded their war captives proudly. Africans were also exported for centuries prior to European involvement. The trans-Saharan slave trade lasted over 1,000 years, moving around 10 million people across the desert to serve in the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean trade similarly transported roughly 5 million people as laborers, domestic servants, or soldiers, with many male slaves castrated, requiring constant replenishment. In West Africa, where the Atlantic trade was centered, slavery was deeply embedded in society. Powerful empires had long relied on complex slave systems. The Ghana Empire, from the 3rd to 13th centuries, established the precedent of West African states building wealth through trans-Saharan trade and slave labor. The Mali Empire, famously enriched under Mansa Musa, extracted salt, copper, and gold through slave labor. Domestic slavery was also common, with female slaves imported from the Mediterranean to serve elite households. Most slaves were acquired through conquest of neighboring kingdoms, too weak to resist. Successor empires, such as Songhai, Jolof, and Kabu, inherited these structures, continuing to acquire slaves as they expanded their territories. Ownership of slaves became a status symbol, representing wealth and power. Slavery took many forms. Some worked the land or mines, others served as soldiers or political advisors. In some areas, slaves could own land and earn enough to buy their freedom. In others, they endured harsher conditions. In Benin, for example, slaves were sometimes sacrificed to mark significant occasions. Europeans arriving on African shores did not find an empty land ripe for enslavement, but complex societies and long-standing slaveholding empires. The Atlantic slave trade began with the Portuguese in the mid-1530 century, initially bringing enslaved people to Europe. In 1526, Portuguese ships carried slaves across the Atlantic to American colonies. Contrary to the common image of Europeans capturing people by force, the majority of enslaved individuals were sold by other Africans. European arrival coincided with the collapse of the Mali Empire, leaving splinter states competing for territory. Europeans offered firearms, giving these rulers an advantage over rivals, while the captives acquired in wars became valuable trade currency. European goods like cloth and ceramics served as status symbols for the emerging African elites. Different African states responded differently to European opportunities. The Kingdom of Congo, for instance, made contact with Portuguese explorers in 1483 and traded thousands of slaves annually. The slaving relationship between African rulers and European powers was often complex and mutually beneficial. For example, King Alfonso I of Congo viewed the Portuguese as a convenient outlet for the surplus slaves captured during his expansionary wars, yet he also maintained authority over the trade. In 1526, he compelled Portugal to recognize his legal framework for slavery, which regulated who could be enslaved and offered protections for those taken illegitimately, mainly his own subjects captured by raiders or opportunists. A similar dynamic existed among the Akan peoples of the modern Ghana-Nigeria region, known as the Gold Coast. They were active participants in both buying and selling slaves. The gold mines fueling Akan wealth in the 16th to 18th centuries relied heavily on enslaved labor purchased from African and European traders alike. In many Akan states, up to a third of the population were enslaved, primarily from non-Akan ethnic groups. African solidarity against European trade was minimal, as long-standing ethnic divisions far predated European contact and were not easily overcome. There was resistance, such as occasional attacks on European ships by coastal raiders, but these were rare and largely ineffective. Small, isolated communities attempting defiance were most vulnerable to enslavement. showing that resistance often offered little protection. One notable exception was the Kingdom of Benin, a small state in what is now southern Nigeria. Initially a trading partner, by the mid-16th century Benin faced severe population loss, especially among men. Rulers Oba Esegi and Oba Orobogo eventually ended Benin's participation in the Atlantic slave trade by closing its ports to European traders. Though domestic slavery persisted, and Benin resisted British efforts to abolish it in the 19th century, this example illustrates that African states responded differently to the pressures of slavery, either engaging in or prohibiting it, based on local circumstances. Of all African slaving states, none was more notorious than Dahomey, which emerged around 1600 along the southern coast of modern Nigeria, and rose to prominence under King Agaja in the early 18th century. Dahomey's strength lay in its well-trained, disciplined standing army, reportedly numbering up to 50,000 at its height. Agaya used this force to conquer neighboring kingdoms such as Alada and Wida, both prolific slave-trading states. By consolidating control over these ports, Dahomey became one of the most formidable slaving powers in history. Dahomey's military culture further reinforced slavery. Men were expected to pursue military careers, leaving non-military labor to enslaved people. The army also required constant engagement to prevent restlessness, prompting frequent attacks and slave raids. By the 19th century, it is estimated that 2/3 of Dahomey's population were enslaved. Slavery was so integral to society that some scholars question whether Dahomey was a state built around slavery or a slaving operation that became a state. Enslaved people were not only laborers, but were woven into the political and religious fabric of Dahomeyan society. Ownership of slaves became a marker of status and power, creating tension between the king and elites, who often controlled their own slave trade networks. Slaves also played a central role in religious and ritual life. Annual ceremonies featured military parades, political assemblies, and human sacrifices intended to appease spirits and protect the kingdom. Hundreds of slaves were killed during these events, sometimes reaching as many as 4,000 in a single day. Similar sacrifices were performed during royal funerals and other major rituals, though smaller-scale killings also occurred for social and religious occasions. Even as European powers began their campaigns against slavery, Dahomey remained deeply committed to the institution, illustrating the entrenched role of slavery in the social, economic, and political structures of certain African states. In 1818, King Gajo of Dahomey was pressured by the British to end slave sacrifices, and by the 1840s, he faced demands to abolish the slave trade entirely. Gajo resisted, declaring that the slave trade was the foundation of his people's wealth and prestige, a source of triumph and status. When the British forced a treaty banning slave trading from Dahomey's ports, it bred deep resentment. The Dahomeyans circumvented the treaty by selling captives overland to ports not bound by its terms. Eventually, relations with the British completely broke down, and by the late 1850s, Dahomey aligned with France, which was less aggressive in enforcing anti-slavery policies. However, the decline of the slave trade undermined Dahomey's economy, forcing desperate raids and conquests that antagonized France. After attacking a French allied town in 1889, France waged 2 wars against Dahomey, citing its commitment to slavery as a moral justification, and ultimately conquered the kingdom in 1894. A common misconception is that European colonization in Africa was always driven by a desire for slaves. While Portugal's colonies, like Angola, were once significant sources of enslaved labor for the Americas, most European colonization occurred after slavery had been abolished. Anti-slavery motivations often guided European expansion. For instance, France invaded Dahomey partly to end its slave trade, and the British similarly acted in Nigeria. In 1851, the Royal Navy attacked Lagos, deposed its king, forced abolition, freed all enslaved people in the territory, and expelled traders. Later, Britain imposed abolition across Nigeria, though domestic slavery persisted for decades due to concerns about provoking unrest. The British conquest of Benin in 1897 followed a similar pattern. After a British expedition was massacred, the British launched a punitive attack, citing slavery as a justification. Hundreds of slaves were sacrificed by the king in hopes of divine protection, but the British repopulated the city with freed slaves and offered emancipation to any who sought refuge. Local elites were slow to accept these changes, and efforts to eliminate slavery continued into the 1920s. It is crucial to recognize that millions of Africans suffered under slavery, whether across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Sahara, or within Africa itself. Yet, this suffering was not solely imposed by foreigners. Africans actively participated in creating, expanding, and enforcing the systems of slavery that exploited others on the continent. African rulers, traders, and raiders facilitated the enslavement of fellow Africans, and this history is as much a part of the continent's past as its experiences as a victim. Africa's involvement in slavery was neither uniquely culpable nor entirely innocent. It was part of a broader human story of suffering, exploitation, and eventual abolition. Understanding this complexity gives a more accurate view of African history and its place in the world, portraying the continent as home to people who were as multifaceted and flawed as any others.